Good morning, and welcome to our series, Poetry for the Soul, Part 5. As you have already heard also, there are so many voices of deep knowledge, vision, and experience. And to read these quotations is almost a meditation. As you have seen and heard from the first 4 in our series, I read and then give some space for the soul to absorb and bring into the heart delight. So we begin with Yevgeny Yevtushenko. Poetry is like a bird. It ignores all frontiers. Poetry is a mixture of common sense, which not all have, with an uncommon sense, which very few have. John Masefield. The poets are almost always wrong about the facts. That's because they're not interested in the facts, only the truth. William Faulkner. A poem is never finished, only abandoned. Paul Valéry. Poetry is an orphan of silence. The words never quite equal the experience behind them. Charles Simic. The poet is the one who breaks through our habits. St. John Peirce. Poetry confronts in the most clear-eyed way just those emotions which consciousness wishes to slide by. C.K. Williams. Poetry may make us, from time to time, a little more aware of the deeper, unnamed feelings which form the substratum of our being, to which we rarely penetrate, for our lives are mostly a constant evasion of ourselves. T.S. Eliot. Poetry is a peerless proficiency of the imagination. Marianne Moore. A poet is, before anything else, a person who is passionately in love with language. W. H. Auden. Here's a quote of James Fenton. Babies are not brought by storks, and poets are not produced by workshops. Poetry is to prose as walking is to dancing. John Wayne. With me, poetry has not been a purpose, but a passion. Edgar Allan Poe. The poet speaks adequately only when he speaks somewhat wildly, not with intellect alone, but with intellect inebriated by nectar. Henry Miller. There are two ways of disliking poetry. One way is to dislike it, the other is to read Pope. Oscar Wilde. The genius of poetry must work out its own salvation in a man. It cannot be matured by law and precept, but by sensitive and watchfulness in itself. That which is creative must create itself. John Keats. Poetry is the voice of the soul, whispering, celebrating, singing even. Carolyn Forsch. A vein of poetry exists in the hearts of all men. Thomas Carlyle. Reading poetry is a way of connecting through the medium of language more deeply with yourself, even as you connect more deeply with another. Edward Hirsch. Any time is the time to make a poem. Gertrude Stein. We don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race, and the human race is filled with passion. Robin Williams. Poetry and hums aren't things which you get. They're things which get you. And all you can do is go where they can find you. Winnie the Pooh. A. Milne. Poetry often enters through the window of irrelevance. M.C. Richards. Publishing a volume of verse is like dropping a rose petal down the Grand Canyon and waiting for the echo. Don Marquis. I gave up on poetry myself 30 years ago, when most of it began to read like coded messages passing between lonely aliens on a hostile world. Russell Baker. And this from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Olympian bards who sung divine ideas below, which always find us young and always keep us so. Another quote by Edgar Allan Poe. I would define, in brief, the poetry of words as the rhythmical creation of beauty. Its sole arbiter is taste. Blessings be with them and eternal praise, who gave us nobler loves and nobler cares, the poets who on earth have made us heirs of truth and pure delight by heavenly lays. At the touch of love, everyone becomes a poet. Plato. My poetry, I should think, has become the way of my giving out what music is within me. County Cullen. A musician must make music. An artist must paint. A poet must write if he is to be ultimately at peace with himself. What one can be, one must be. Abraham Maslow. Poetry is the language in which man explores his own amazement. Christopher Fry. When power narrows the areas of man's concern, poetry reminds him of the richness and diversity of his existence. When power corrupts, poetry cleanses. John F. Kennedy. Painting is silent poetry, and poetry is painting with the gift of speech. Simonides. A poet is someone who is astonished by everything. Anonymous. Genius is mainly an affair of energy, and poetry is mainly an affair of genius. Therefore, a nation whose spirit is characterized by energy may well be immanent in poetry. And we have Shakespeare, Matthew Arnold. When it comes to atoms, language can be used only as in poetry. The poet, too, is not nearly so concerned with describing facts as with creating images. Niels Bohr. Reality only reveals itself when it is illuminated by a ray of poetry. Georges Braque. Again from John Cage, there is poetry as soon as we realize that we possess nothing. Poetry is of so subtle a spirit that in the pouring out of one's language into another, it will evaporate. John Denham. in science, one tries to tell people, in such a way as to be understood by everyone, something that no one ever knew before. But in poetry, it's the exact opposite. Paul Dirac. Poetry should help not only to refine the language of the time, but to prevent it from changing too rapidly. T.S. Eliot. There is not a particle of life which does not bear poetry within it. Gustave Flaubert. Science sees signs. Poetry, the thing signified. Augustus and Julius Hare. Poetry is to hold judgment on your soul. Henrik Ibsen. Most people ignore most poetry because most poetry ignores most people. Adrian Mitchell. We especially need imagination in science. It is not all mathematics, not all logic, but it is somewhat beauty and poetry. Maria Mitchell. And Beverly Nichols gives a definition of marriage. A book of which the first chapter is written in poetry and the remaining chapters in prose. And the last one. The office of poetry is not to make us think accurately, but feel truly. Frederick William Robertson.